Hello there, argument class. This video is about the reading from Stephen Toulmin, uses of argument. Excuse me. And this is only going to cover the first 4 sections or so of Toulmin, but it's the part of Toulmin that you'd be expected to be able to say something about. If someone said, "Oh, you studied argument, you took an argument class," you would expect to be able to say something about Toulmin and his ideas. So in this short video, I'm going to do the basics of what Toulmin is all about and what he's trying to do in this reading. This is something that was written in the 1950s. So the first thing to know about it is all of the assumptions that you've been reading in the book by Tyndale. All these things are really things that are post-Toulmin assumptions that he's making about argument. At the time when Toulmin's writing this, argument is something that is purely logical. It's highly philosophical. It's governed by principles of the argument being incredibly accurate. And the way that people talk every day is seen as insufficient or deficient in terms of good argumentation. What Toulmin is trying to do in this book is to work the other way, very much like what Chris Tyndale is doing in his book, working the other way from audience back to making argument theory. What Toulmin is trying to do is saying we can have a perfectly rational, reasonable, logical argumentation theory based on how people actually talk and make claims and make arguments to each other. So that's what he's trying to do. And in the first couple of sections, he's establishing some of the basic groundwork for what's in this section. But the most important thing in this section for you to understand, or in the early sections for this section to understand, is the idea of field dependency. Field dependency is Toulmin's idea that arguments are not true or false. They are true. They are believable, acceptable, and make sense only in the fields where their structure, where the way that they are supported, would be accepted. So scientific arguments might not be acceptable in a family situation or a public situation. And likewise, the arguments that might work in a newspaper, on television, or on YouTube, in a politics channel, might not work in a group of people who are very much in the field of political science, for example. But that doesn't mean that one is worse than the other one. That's an important understanding to make about Toulmin. Is he's not passing judgment about we do not argue correctly. He's saying that we do not theorize, teach, or account for argument correctly, or in a way that would be actually useful to people. Argumentation in the 1950s is really concerned with trying to repair what they see as a flaw in the philosophical treatments of argument, which is you had fascism run wild across Europe, Italian fascism, German fascism, and create a world war and create genocide and all kinds of horrible things. And the disconnect for people is, well, we teach logic, we teach reasoning and logic. How can people buy such bad arguments? How can people accept such bad reasoning? And what they're trying to figure out is maybe there's something wrong with that theory or that approach. And so this starts what we would call modern argumentation studies, which is what you've kind of been reading about in the class. So Toulmin's idea of field dependency leads him to a model or structure of argument that he's talking about here in section 3. He starts the chapter by saying we need to consider arguments not just in their larger organism level, but on a cellular level. He wants to look at it at the cellular level, the physiological level, where we're looking at it in the micro to see if there's anything in the macro that might correspond there. So as an organic thing, we have to look at argument as a creature, as a living thing. And that's a very strange idea if you're looking at it from the traditional philosophical logical point of view, that argument would be alive or be looked at like an organism. Like, what's it doing? It's going to do what it does, and we have to kind of look at it. We can't control it. We didn't make it. So we have to look at it and try to determine what it's doing. And that's what Toulmin is saying. That's kind of his approach here in the beginning. So he has a couple of questions for us here at the beginning. How should we lay out an argument if we're interested in its validity? and is the acceptability of that argument based on the formal structure. So this gets into questions of structure and structure's bearing on argument. He's going to say that validity, and this is kind of a spoiler, so if you want to wait till the end of the video, you can like mute for the next 20 seconds or so. He says that near the end that validity doesn't matter that much, that it's about acceptability, and validity is really just kind of moving words around in a way that creates kind of eccentric points of view that then could be defended or examined as curiosities. But the way that people argue in everyday life, they're perfectly fine with his model and using variance of terminology to talk about what it is that they're trying to prove. So is argument geometrical or is it procedural? Is it like geometry, which I know you all loved from high school, or is it procedural like a courtroom? Is it more like legal studies or the law or the way lawyers argue? Or is it more like the way geometry and math argue? And he's going to say it's a lot more like legal studies, that geometry has a place and a use there, but that's a little too rigorous. And most of the time it's more like legal studies where you can have 17 different kinds of questions that all need to be argued in different ways and have different types of proof and different ways of finding those arguments acceptable. And that's what he talks about a lot in this segment. So I wonder if you read it, what do you think? Do you think one of the questions for you to think about is, what's the right way to think about argument? We argue in so many different fields. What's the right way to conceive of and to think about arguments structure and the relationship of structure to that? Some people, on the internet these days are obsessed with fallacies. And fallacies assume the structure of an argument is everything. That is, if the structure is inappropriate, the argument is false. I don't know how far we can go with that. A lot of fallacies, since they rely so heavily on structure, don't take into account field dependency. They don't take into account the situation or the context. And they're not always false. We'll be reading about that later in the course. A pretty good essay about how sometimes these fallacies they're not always a fatal flaw. Sometimes the reasoning makes sense, which makes sense for fallacy theory because the way they work is they trick us into thinking that something is reasonable. So something to think about later. So he says the traditional source of arguments, logical structure, is the syllogism by Aristotle. And you might not know what a syllogism is. Syllogism is where you make a massively broad true premise, then you make a minor premise about a category of things you're looking at, and then as you deduce from those two things, the conclusion is something true. He says there's a certain number of premises you can have, all, some, or none, and that's way too thin for the amount of argumentation that we do in everyday life. The law is crazy complex on this. There are all kinds of concerns in law about this, that if the law is a limited view of what we can argue about, if that's a specialized view, daily life argument should at least be as broad as that, if not broader. And that makes sense. It's like an argument from the topoi of larger to smaller, smaller to larger. So it makes a lot of sense to me, what he's saying there. What are the bare bones of what we need when we're making an argument? Toulmin says we need to make an assertion and then be able to back that assertion up when it's pressed. Once we make an assertion, we want maximum understanding and maximum assent. We want people to go, oh, okay, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I believe you. Yeah, I agree. That's what we want when we offer an argument, right? So the first question that has to be resolved for Toulmin is, what do we have to go on? And he calls this data. He says it's the datum or the information. And your claim, your assertion, is backed up by some set of information that you would make apparent. So, I think it's going to rain. It's going to rain today. And you say, oh, well, what do you have to go on? Well, look at the clouds, or I heard it on the radio, or I saw it on my phone, on the app on my phone. All of those are different forms of datum that support that claim. The way they get there is quite a bit different, and the quality of what they offer is quite a bit different, which are things we can push on. After we establish the how do we get there, every argument, Toulmin says, has an inference in it that he calls the warrant. The warrant is the connection between the data and the conclusion. So a warrant is, what is that hypothetical leap that allows you to say, well, because I see that it's cloudy, I think it's going to rain later. A great example of this I have from the DAC, from D'Angelo Center, where there's the Taco Bell on campus, and I used to go to the Taco Bell a lot. Probably more than any human being should go to the on-campus Taco Bell. But if it wasn't copyright issue, I'd play that Pizza at Taco Bell song here because it's really good. I like that song a lot. There were two guys in line, and one of them was saying, I don't know what to get. What should I get here? And the other is saying, everything is good. Everything tastes good here. It's great. He's like, well, I think I might get a Burrito Supreme, or maybe I'll get a Crunch Wrap. Yeah, I think I'll get the Crunch Wrap because that's pretty good. And then the other guy just said, yeah, everything here is good. So this is kind of an interesting kind of argument from the Toulmin position because it follows that syllogistic pattern, but it also has this idea of the warrant in it as well, which is, well, if I know everything is good here, and that's based on, well, I eat here all the time, well, then anything on that menu is going to be good by that connected property. But if we made it a little bit more complex, we would find that the warrant is something really essential to argumentation. And the warrant is that leap that you go from a piece of information to something bigger. So let's say that there's something new on the menu. How would we know that that was good? We'd say, well, everything I've ever had here is pretty good. Hypothetical leap, this one will be good too. Why? Well, the warrant would say that if a place is known for making really good stuff, it is pretty likely, overwhelmingly likely, that the new item on the menu will also be good. So they're hypothetical jumps, and sometimes they don't really seem like they're that different than data. In fact, Toulmin talks about this explicitly in the chapter. He says there are some times where you can distinguish it, but don't get too caught up on the words. Don't get too caught up on the difference between data and warrant. They're just answers that could be the same thing worded differently to the same questions of what do you have to go on, which we could say, what's your evidence, what's your proof, or what's your information, what are your facts, somebody might say, and the connection of those facts to the claim, which is what we call the warrant. Is that justified? Is that jump justified? And that's what arguments about the warrant are. It's an implicit connection that is about the soundness of all types of warrants. So what's interesting about the warrant is it's like there's a whole type of reasoning that we do as people that has to be defended every time. But you're only defending it to the point where you're making that claim about that particular thing. So think about a legal situation. Toulmin's always going back to the law, and this is his example. Think about a legal situation. There are questions of what the law says and what the law says the rulings can be, and then there's a question about evidence, testimony, and facts. So that's the difference between data and warrant. The data is the testimony or the facts or the things that the case is based on, and things about the law, legal reasoning, what the law says, that's the warrant. So the warrant would say in all cases of speeding, there can never be any jail time, or the fine must be between $100 and $300. They say, well, in this case of speeding this much in this kind of a zone, the fine should be $300. Well, why? Oh, well, because that's what the law says the fine should be, and it's justified based on the data. So this seems like a very common sense way of reasoning, and the reason why is because it is. Toulmin's trying to theorize out of something that's very natural and basic to us in our interactions of, well, what do you mean by that? Why do you believe that? How do you know that's true? These kind of basic everyday interactions are the things that Toulmin's trying to make a theory out of to account for a working theory of argument that actually applies to the way people do it every day. People don't do formal logic the way Aristotle said it every day. There might be some people out there, Toulmin recognizes, very uncomfortable with this, who are very strict in their adherence to logic and adherence to philosophy and reason, to the point where they would say all warrants are invalid because they're just sort of hypothetical guesses. We don't absolutely know they're true. So they're all invalid, so we can't accept any of them. This would be like a very strong form of skepticism. And Toulmin says, for people like this, any kind of rationalization, any kind of discussion becomes impossible because they're looking for something that just never exists in the kind of things that we talk about. There's always a gap there. It's never quite there, but that's how it works. It's never absolutely certain, but that's how it works. The data is there. We can be pretty certain about the data. That's verifiable unless someone's giving testimony, but there are techniques for pushing on testimony. So the data is always there. The warrant is never quite sure, but that's how we move there. You say, well, my movement from this data to this claim is justified based on the warrant. So here's an image. Let me bring it up here so I know what I'm talking about. So here's the image of the basic Toulmin model. This is straight out of the reading here. So the arrow between data and the claim is a so, or since, blah, so, see, right? Data, so, claim. Since, warrant. So he gives these weird examples. Harry was born in Bermuda, so Harry's a British subject because a man born in Bermuda will be a British subject. It's a very simple kind of example. But you could say, Harry is sitting in my class with me, so Harry is a St. John's student, since somebody sitting in a class with me would be a St. John's student. It's not 100% true, but it's reasonable, and that's why Toulmin is so important to understand, or important to get a grasp on, because this idea of data, claim, warrant has permeated rhetorical argumentation in such a way that there's really no escape from it. Everyone is really thinking about argument in this way, and it's a real testament to Toulmin for how he explained it, but it's also more of like he just really nailed kind of how we reason on the everyday. He adds in a couple of other things. He says, well, sometimes we want to talk about the force of the warrant in a different way. So he comes up with this term, the qualifier. And the qualifier is a phrase that allows us to see how intensely the connection is there. We would say things like, well, he's most likely a student at this university. He's most likely, or we go back to Taco Bell. It's like, well, it most likely is going to taste pretty good. Instead of, it's just going to taste good, full stop. Sometimes we don't really like to make claims like that. So qualifier shows the listener how intensely they should take the warrant, or how strong that inference is. They say, well, probably most of the time a new thing is, well, most of the time a new thing tastes pretty good. Most of the time they nail it. Okay, that's a qualifier. Instead of, it's going to be delicious. Most of the time it'll be delicious. And that's an important part of how people argue every day. And the rebuttal is another thing you add to it that tells you the conditions under which your claim would be untrue. Any kind of exceptions. Well, unless they're visiting the campus, or unless the person is just sitting in on the class, or in our class, we have the Discord. If someone's in the Discord, you might assume they're a St. John's student, unless they're like a friend of the professor, unless they're someone who's graduated, or unless they're just visiting the Discord and they're a friend of somebody else in the class, that kind of thing. Those are the conditions under which the thing would be untrue. Both the qualifier and the rebuttal can serve as data. They're more information to the argument, but they really are important because they help scale the commitment level of the argument. So if someone says it absolutely is going to taste good, or they say, well, most of the time it'll taste good unless there's something weird in it, or unless they don't know how to make it properly, it shows you what you're willing to defend. So these aren't cop-outs. These are important moves for argumentation if you think of argumentation as having the goal of increasing understanding or being communicative. Some people do not think of argumentation that way. Some people think of argumentation as it's a way to figure out what's true. None of this will help with that if that's the position you get in. But also, Toulmin says, all of that stuff, looking for the truth in all of it, ignores 95 to 99% of the way people normally argue. So he's trying to make a case of how can we help people do better what they do anyway, rather than how can we make an ideal argumentation process. And that's an important distinction to think about. He borrows this idea from math. You can correctly calculate a math problem, but you might have applied the wrong method to it. It's a very important distinction to think about. So I can add something up correctly, but if my data is bad, the answer is bad, even though I did the process right. I can use the formula and apply the formula correctly, but if the formula doesn't apply to what I'm trying to figure out, then it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't accomplish anything. Likewise, the same thing in argumentation. I can argue extremely well using formal logical principles, but it might not apply. I might not have connected to the field dependency. I might not have connected to the people in the audience. And that's an important consideration to think about too. So in this section, you might think about what you think the role of the qualifier and rebuttal and the warrant are, and the kinds of arguments you're looking at from the different books, or the kind of things you're kind of thinking about as you put your argument together. How important is accuracy, and how important is context to any kind of understanding of argument? That might be something worth thinking about. Okay, another addition. Oh, I forgot to say there's a picture. Okay, so now we have the qualifier, and the rebuttal added in there too. So this makes it more complicated with Harry being born in Bermuda, as you can see here in this example. This is also from the book. This is on page 94. So yeah, it's just the visual aids that are in the book. They're perfectly fine, although they're about weird things. There are lots of different examples you can plug in there and see how it is. I mean, think about arguments you hear in the media that you consume, discussions and things you have with your friends. Think about that when you're thinking about the Toulmin model. It really does kind of play into the way people talk about this stuff. It is how people talk about this stuff. Okay, the last part of the Toulmin model is backing, which is the question of whether the warrant itself is justified. In the full form of the warrant, like if we think about the rainstorm example, I see clouds, it's going to rain. Well, somebody might question whether or not the presence of clouds justifies the claim that rain is there. Is presence enough of a sign? Not just the presence of clouds, but presence itself. Is that a reasonable way to draw inferences and make arguments? And that's what backing is why is that a valid form of rationalizing one's claim or one's opinion about things, which is what an argument really is according to Toulmin, is making a claim, making your opinion, putting it out there as an assertion and backing it up to get people to believe you. Backing is always field dependent. It has to follow the rules of reasoning, logic, and evidence of that field. There are no universals here for Toulmin. There's no universally right evidence. There's really no such thing as the facts, which is a tough thing to kind of wrap your head around. But for Toulmin and people who follow him, the facts are field dependent as well, which means there are certain things recognized as a fact in everyday life that just wouldn't hold up the scrutiny of science, and vice versa. There are certain things that are factual that have a lot of trouble being interpreted in different fields as factual. So you have to think about that too when you think about the backing. Backing is a categorical statement of why something is a good way to reason, versus the warrant, which is a hypothetical leap in an uncertain situation as to how things are going to connect. So that's the difference between backing and warrant there. The backing shows there's enough factual or real basis for the inference as a whole. So the inference of if someone's present in a classroom, they go to the school, is pretty strong. Weaker is the warrant, where if someone's in the Discord, they go to St. John's. That's weaker. You see, that's the difference between backing and the warrant. So if someone challenges, well, what's the connection here? And then you give them the connection. Well, if someone's in the class, they probably go here. They might say, oh, that's a bad way of reasoning. That's not always true. Then you're into a backing conversation, and you have to defend where your warrant comes from in order to set that up. So in the rest of the reading, which is less relevant in this model, oh yeah, here's an image. I have another image for you. Look at that. So here's the one with the backing in it on account of the following statutes and other legal provisions. That's the backing. So if someone says something like, well, if someone does this, they're going to go to jail. They say, well, how do you know that? Well, according to the law, if you are in possession of these drugs, you're going to go to jail for these mandatory minimums. Oh, okay. And that's enough for the backing. So the other stuff is that he's talking about syllogisms, and he's talking about other stuff at the end of the section. You can read that if you want to. He's pretty much taking on traditional analysis of argument in philosophy and saying, we have a more serviceable model with my data claim warrant model than you do in the syllogism, than you do in classical logical thought, because people in their regular idiomatic speech, and what he means by idiomatic speech is everyday language, everyday speech, people are already kind of saying these things about data claim warrant. What's important in this section is he says validity is really a question of moving the pieces around. You don't really change much of the substance of the argument. But soundness is whether or not people are going to buy it. Soundness is kind of like, does this make sense to me? Is this reasonable? And that's the heart of argumentation for Toulmin. That's what he wants to focus on, is how something could be valid. And if we just teach validity, and if we just look at structural validity and we say, well, it's not wrong, that's not good enough for arguments that will shape our actions and attitudes towards the world. Soundness is the more important thing. So when you think about the Toulmin model, you want to think about a model of how we figure out whether or not an argument is worth believing, not whether it's constructed correctly. So on the mathematical premise, it's not about adding it up right. It's about, is this the right formula being applied? And there's a little wiggle room in terms of that. Like, how in math you would get credit for showing your work, even if you got the answer wrong. It's the only way I passed math. I don't know about you guys. You might all be math majors. I don't know. That's the very quick sort of introduction to the Toulmin model. In section 3 of uses of arguments, layouts of arguments. If you liked this video, I can make some more on Toulmin. Let me know. If you're in my class, this should help you get through the reading for Unit 2 to kind of help you understand what Toulmin's going on about. He's trying to create a model that services everyday interactivity of people when they argue.